The air over Papua New Guinea in 1944 was thick with humidity and the electric tension of war. Lieutenant Gerald Jerry W. Bramblett, a young yet seasoned pilot in the United States Army Air Forces, sat in the cramped cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, his fingers lightly gripping the control yoke. The twin-boomed aircraft hummed like a caged predator, its Allison engines vibrating through his bones. Jerry's mission that day was a reconnaissance sweep deep into enemy territory. A dangerous flight path through mountains cloaked in mist, jungles so dense they seemed to swallow light, and skies patrolled by both the elements and enemy fighters. At just 24 years old, Jerry had already survived encounters that would haunt other men for a lifetime. He was known among his squadron for his calm under fire, a pilot who could thread his Lightning between mountain ridges with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. But that morning, as he taxied onto the rain-slick runway, there was a strange stillness in his chest, a feeling he couldn't name, one that made the air feel heavier than usual. The mission was routine on paper. Fly low over suspected supply routes, photograph enemy convoys, and return before fuel reserves dipped dangerously low. But in the Pacific Theater, routine was a word without meaning. Each flight could be your last, undone by a sudden squall, a mechanical failure, or a burst of flak from a hidden gun nest. Jerry knew this. Every man on the base knew this. Still, he gave a brief wave to the crew chief, adjusted his goggles, and pushed the throttles forward. The Lightning roared down the strip and lifted into the gray morning, disappearing into a veil of low clouds. Within minutes, the familiar landmarks of the coast were gone, replaced by an endless ocean of green. The jungles below were alive with secrets, tribes untouched by modern civilization, rivers that carved paths older than history, and somewhere, countless wrecks from missions gone wrong, their aluminum skins slowly surrendering to the vines. Radio chatter crackled in his headset. Reports of storm activity ahead. Jerry adjusted his course slightly, skirting a wall of dark clouds. Rain lashed against the canopy, and lightning flickered in the distance. His cameras clicked rhythmically, capturing the shadowy patterns of roads hidden beneath the jungle canopy. Fuel gauges ticked down. He was making good time until the storm shifted. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Instruments wavered. A downdraft caught the Lightning's wing and yanked it violently downward. Jerry fought the controls, muscles straining. The altimeter spun. Somewhere in that blinding wall of rain and turbulence, the P-38 vanished. When Jerry failed to return, the base launched search planes. Days of reconnaissance yielded nothing. The jungle had swallowed another machine, another man, without a trace. Letters were sent home. His name was carved into the roll of the missing. For decades, the wreckage lay hidden, cradled by the earth and shielded by the relentless green of Papua New Guinea. The war ended. Nations rebuilt. But Jerry Bramblett's final flight remained a ghost story, whispered among veterans and adventurers alike. The decades that followed transformed the world, but in the depths of Papua New Guinea's jungles, time barely moved. The trees grew thicker, their roots gripping the soil like the fingers of a jealous guardian. Vines twisted around ancient trunks, their green tendrils weaving a living wall that sealed away secrets from human eyes. Rain fell in endless cycles, washing over the landscape, erasing footprints, and feeding the relentless growth that consumed anything left behind. In that forgotten place, beneath the humid canopy and the hum of unseen insects, Jerry Bramblett's P-38 Lightning slept, a silver ghost slowly wearing a coat of moss and rust. Explorers and historians had long speculated about the fate of pilots like Jerry. Many believed the wreckage had tumbled into a mountain ravine or vanished beneath a river's current. Others imagined it reduced to fragments by enemy fire. Expeditions over the years had scoured regions of Papua New Guinea, but the terrain fought them at every step. This was not a land that yielded its mysteries easily. Each journey required weeks of hacking through dense undergrowth, crossing rivers swollen with crocodiles, and enduring heat that drained the will to move. In the early 2000s, a small group of adventurers, part aviation historians, part treasure hunters, set their sights on a cluster of ridges where local villagers told stories of a bird of metal that had fallen from the sky long ago. They were armed with maps from wartime archives, GPS equipment, and the kind of stubborn determination only found in people who spend their lives chasing ghosts. The villagers warned them. The jungle here was alive, not in the way most people understood, but with a will of its own. Paths changed overnight. Storms arrived without warning, and sometimes the forest simply refused to let go of what it had claimed. It was deep into one of these ridges, after days of pushing forward through choking humidity and swarms of insects, that the team first saw it, just a glint of dull metal through the green. At first, they thought it might be a rock catching the light. But as they cleared away the vines, the familiar curve of a wing emerged, followed by the twin tail booms. Their hearts raced. The jungle had not destroyed the lightning. It had preserved it. There it was, the P-38 Lightning, remarkably intact despite more than 60 years of exposure. The canopy glass was fogged and pitted, but still in place. In the cockpit, dials sat frozen mid-reading, and the seatbelt straps hung limp, frayed but still recognizable. A few personal effects, a rusted compass, the remains of a leather glove, rested silently inside. It was as though the aircraft had landed and simply waited for someone to return. The silence in that moment was heavy. No one spoke. Each member of the team felt the weight of history pressing in, as if the jungle itself understood that this was more than just a discovery of metal and rivets. This was the final chapter of a man's story, paused for 6 decades, waiting for the world to turn the page. News of the discovery rippled quietly through the small network of WO2 aviation historians before reaching a broader audience. The location was kept confidential at first, not out of secrecy for secrecy's sake, but to protect the site from looters and souvenir hunters. Too many wrecks had been stripped bare in the past, their historical value reduced to fragments sold in shadowy collector markets. The team knew this one was different. This was not just twisted metal, it was a time capsule. In the following weeks, photographs taken at the site began circulating among military archives and veteran organizations. The images were haunting. The P-38's fuselage still bore traces of its original paint, now dulled and streaked by decades of rain. One of the propeller blades was slightly bent, suggesting the engines were still running at the moment of impact. The tail numbers were barely visible but enough to confirm the aircraft's identity. Lieutenant Gerald W. Bramblett's final mission. The discovery drew in both historians and forensic experts. The site's isolation made any recovery operation a logistical nightmare. There were no roads, no clearings for helicopters. Every piece of equipment, every step forward, would have to be carried by hand through miles of unforgiving jungle. Yet there was an unspoken understanding among those involved. This wasn't about recovering an airplane. It was about bringing closure to a story that had been suspended in mid-air since 1944. Local villagers, many of whom were descendants of those who had witnessed the war from the shadows of the forest, shared their own oral histories. They spoke of the day the metal bird came down, how it had roared above the trees before vanishing into the mist with a sound like thunder. Some claimed to have seen smoke curling upward. Others swore there had been none at all. The truth had blurred over the decades, but the memory lingered. When the team finally approached the cockpit, they did so with reverence. The controls were still locked in a final position, the throttle levers set as Jerry had left them. Mud and leaves had seeped into the footwells, but the pilot's seat seemed eerily untouched, as though waiting for its occupant to return. They found no remains. Whether Jerry had bailed out or been claimed by the crash itself was a question the jungle still kept for itself. A small patch of sunlight broke through the canopy that day, casting the aircraft in a pale, ghostly glow. Cameras clicked, not to capture a prize, but to bear witness. The silence after each shutter felt almost like a prayer. This was not just an aircraft lost to time. It was a fragment of a man's courage, frozen in the moment when the world was at war. The story of Jerry Bramblett, once a line on a casualty list, now had a tangible anchor in the present. The jungle had hidden him, but it had also preserved his last stand. And for those who stood there, the question was no longer how he vanished, but how his story would now be told. Efforts to document the site became an exercise in patience and precision. Every inch of the P-38 was photographed from multiple angles, every visible marking recorded before nature could reclaim it once more. The team worked in shifts, mindful of the oppressive heat and the lurking dangers of the jungle. Snakes coiled in the underbrush, sudden downpours that turned the ground into sucking mud, and swarms of mosquitoes that seemed to rise like a living cloud at dusk. Yet none of it dampened their determination. They began piecing together the sequence of events from the evidence before them. The propeller's bent edge hinted at a forced landing or controlled crash, rather than a direct nose-first impact. The landing gear was retracted, meaning Jerry had been airborne until the final seconds. The lack of major fire damage suggested the fuel tanks hadn't exploded. Perhaps the rain had doused the wreck instantly, or perhaps they'd been nearly empty when the lightning came down. Each detail was a clue, and the jungle had become both a crime scene and a shrine. Among the cockpit's remnants, the team uncovered a faded map still tucked into a side compartment. The paper, remarkably preserved in the humid environment, bore pencil-marked notations, routes, waypoints, and what looked like a hastily scrawled set of numbers. It was the kind of artifact that turned speculation into something almost intimate, as if Jerry's thoughts from that day were whispering across the decades. A small leather pouch, water-damaged but intact, contained a few personal effects: a tarnished Zippo lighter, a single dog tag, and a pocket knife with a worn wooden handle. Word of these finds began to filter back to the United States. Military historians requested more information, while surviving members of Jerry's squadron, now elderly men, were stunned to learn that his aircraft had been located after so many years. For them, it was like hearing the voice of a long-lost friend echo from the past. One veteran recalled Jerry's calm confidence, another his dry sense of humor. They had mourned him in 1944, but the jungle's revelation had reopened memories long sealed away. Still, the mystery remained. What had happened in those final moments? The storm that day was well documented in wartime weather logs, a chaotic front that had disrupted multiple flights. It was possible that Jerry had been caught in a downdraft, losing altitude too quickly to recover. Perhaps mechanical failure had compounded the danger, or maybe enemy fire had struck a critical system just as the storm closed in. Without definitive evidence, the question hung in the humid air, unanswered. As the team prepared to leave the site for the season, they marked its coordinates with care, knowing it might be years before anyone returned. The jungle, after all, had its own rules. It had hidden the lightning for over 6 decades. It could just as easily take it back. And as the explorers turned to begin the long trek out, each of them glanced one last time at the silver shape resting in the green shadows, silent, steadfast, and still guarding its secrets. Back in the United States, the confirmation of Jerry Bramblett's aircraft stirred something far deeper than historical curiosity. It reignited a personal story that had been frozen for more than 60 years. News reached the Bramblett family, who had long lived with a sentence that ended in a comma, not a period. Missing in action. They had no grave to visit, no wreckage to mourn over. Just a photograph of a young man in uniform and a few faded letters he'd sent home from the Pacific. Now suddenly, there was a place, a tangible link to his last hours. The first call came from a distant nephew, a man Jerry had never met but who had grown up hearing his name like a legend whispered at family gatherings. Soon cousins, great-nieces, and even younger generations who had only seen his face in sepia-toned pictures were reaching out to the historians. They wanted to know everything: what the plane looked like now, where it rested, what was found inside. Their questions carried both urgency and reverence, as if speaking his name now might somehow carry across the years to the cockpit in the jungle. Historians began compiling a complete profile of Jerry's service. Born in Texas, trained as a fighter pilot in the intense heat of the Arizona desert, he had shipped out to the Pacific in early 1944. His squadron was tasked with some of the most dangerous missions: low-altitude reconnaissance over enemy-controlled territory. The P-38 Lightning was perfect for the job, fast, agile, and capable of long-range flights. But it was not invincible, and Jerry knew it. Letters home hinted at both his pride in flying it and his awareness of the risks. "If I make it through this," one line read, "I'll have a lifetime's worth of stories to tell." The family learned about the artifacts discovered at the site. The dog tag, though tarnished, bore his name clearly. The lighter and pocket knife were familiar items from stories told by Jerry's older brother, who had once borrowed both before Jerry left for basic training. Holding these objects in their hands decades later, the family felt as though they were shaking hands with the past. Plans began to take shape for a memorial trip, not to recover the aircraft, which would remain in the jungle as a protected site, but to stand as close as possible to where Jerry's final mission ended. Logistically, it was daunting. The terrain was unforgiving, and only those prepared for a grueling expedition could attempt it. But for the Bramblets, the idea of retracing Jerry's last flight path was no longer a question of if, but when. In the meantime, the site remained under the watchful care of both the local villagers and the historian team. They understood that this wasn't just about an aircraft or even a single man. It was about every pilot whose story had ended somewhere beyond the maps, swallowed by war and wilderness. And as the first plans for an official commemoration took shape, the P-38 Lightning continued to rest where it had for 6 decades, its twin tails pointing toward the sky, as if still waiting for orders to take off once more. The journey to the crash site for the Bramblet family and the accompanying historical team began like stepping into another world. They flew first to Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, then boarded a small propeller-driven plane bound for a remote airstrip carved out of the jungle. From there, the only way forward was on foot. Guides from the local village, men who knew the forest as if it were a living relative, led the way, cutting through the undergrowth with machetes that flashed briefly in the filtered sunlight. The deeper they traveled, the more the modern world fell away. The forest was a cathedral of green, towering trees that blocked out the sun, vines as thick as a man's arm, and the constant layered sound of life: bird calls, insect hums, and the rustle of unseen animals moving just beyond sight. The air was heavy, clinging to the skin, each breath tasting faintly of earth and rain. Progress was slow. Slippery hills rose and fell, rivers had to be waded or crossed on narrow hand-cut bridges, and the mud seemed to conspire against each step. After nearly 2 days of trekking, they reached the ridge where the P-38 had come to rest. Even with the coordinates, it took time for the jungle to reveal the aircraft. At first the visitors saw only hints: a metallic curve under moss, the outline of a wing barely distinguishable from the shadows. But as the guides and team members cleared back the vines, the Lightning emerged in full, as though it had been waiting to be seen again. For the Bramblet family, it was a moment of stillness in the chaos of the jungle. Faces tightened, eyes welled with tears. They stepped closer, hands trembling, and touched the weathered metal skin of the aircraft. The dog tag was shown to them, carefully preserved since its recovery years earlier. In that moment, the decades collapsed. Jerry was no longer just a name in a war record. He was tangible again, his presence woven into the very place they stood. The historian spoke softly, describing the aircraft's features, pointing out the cockpit instruments frozen in their last readings, the propellers, the fuselage markings still faintly visible. The family listened in silence, their hands tracing rivets and seams as though memorizing them by touch. A wreath was placed on the wing, adorned with small paper cranes folded in the U.S. and carried here in a waterproof pouch. The villagers watched respectfully, understanding the gravity of the moment even without shared language. That night, the group camped a short distance from the site. In the darkness, the sounds of the jungle seemed amplified, a living reminder of the isolation that had hidden the P-38 for so long. The Bramblets spoke quietly by the campfire, sharing family memories Jerry had never heard. Stories of weddings, children, and lives that had grown in his absence. Some imagined what he might have done after the war, had fate allowed him to return home. And though no one said it out loud, each person there felt the same unshakable truth. The jungle had not just hidden Jerry. It had safeguarded him, holding his story in trust until someone came to carry it home. At sunrise, the jungle awoke in a chorus of sound. Exotic birds calling from unseen perches, insects buzzing in rhythmic swells, and the distant rush of a waterfall hidden somewhere beyond the trees. The Bramblet family returned to the crash site one final time, knowing this would be their last encounter with the aircraft before the long journey home. Morning light filtered through the canopy in narrow golden shafts, catching on the P-38's weathered aluminum and making it gleam faintly, as though it still carried the energy of flight. The historians used the early hours to make final measurements and document the aircraft from angles they hadn't yet captured. Close-up photographs of the cockpit revealed minute details. The cracked leather padding along the canopy frame, the dusting of fine moss along the instrument panel, the faint lettering on switches that once controlled the Lightning's deadly speed. It was here, leaning close to the glass, that one of the team noticed something wedged between the pilot's seat and the fuselage wall. A small folded scrap of cloth. Carefully, they eased it free. Time had stained it nearly brown, but traces of its original olive drab hue remained. It was a handkerchief, marked with faint initials. GWB. The Bramblet family stood in silence as it was presented to them, each recognizing it as something that had likely been in Jerry's pocket on the morning of his final flight. It was another piece of the puzzle, but more than that, it was a human imprint, a quiet reminder of the man behind the mission. Before leaving, the family gathered in a circle at the nose of the aircraft. A few words were spoken, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Gratitude that the wreck had been found. Gratitude that the jungle had preserved so much of it. Gratitude that, at last, they could stand in the place where Jerry's courage met its final test. A moment of silence followed, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the leaves, almost like the sigh of an unseen witness. The hike back was quieter than the journey in. The family carried the artifacts close, sealed and protected from the elements. Each step away from the crash site felt both like a retreat and a fulfillment of purpose. The guides moved ahead with practiced ease, but even they glanced back occasionally as though acknowledging the spirit of the place they had just left. When the party emerged from the jungle days later, blinking in the harsh midday light of the small airstrip, the modern world seemed almost foreign. Cell phones lit up with messages and news alerts, but no digital signal could match the weight of what they carried in memory. The wreck of Jerry Bramblet's P-38 would remain in the jungle, untouched and protected. But its story, his story, was now free to move through the world once more. And for the first time since 1944, the Bramblet family no longer spoke of Jerry in the tense of the missing. He had been found, not in the way they once hoped, but in a way that bound his legacy to a place and a moment in history forever. Months after the expedition, the story of Lieutenant Gerald Jerry W. Bramblet's final mission began to ripple outward, crossing oceans and decades in its journey. Military museums reached out to the family, offering to display the artifacts alongside his service record. Documentaries requested interviews, and aviation enthusiasts spoke of the P-38 Lightning in reverent tones, as if it were not merely a machine, but a vessel of memory. Yet the family was careful with the story. They wanted it told truthfully, without embellishment, because the truth was powerful enough on its own. In the small Texas town where Jerry had grown up, A ceremony was organized in his honor. Local veterans raised the flags, school children read aloud from his wartime letters, and photographs of the crash site were displayed on easels for all to see. The dog tag, the pocket knife, and the handkerchief, each carefully preserved, were placed in a glass case, their tarnish and wear speaking more than words ever could. For the first time, Jerry's name was carved into a memorial stone not as missing in action, but as found 2005. Meanwhile, the crash site in Papua New Guinea remained as it had been for 6 decades, guarded by the villagers who had first guided the explorers there. They saw it not as a curiosity, but as a sacred space, a place where the jungle's ancient patience had intersected with human courage. Occasionally, a historian or filmmaker was permitted to visit under strict conditions. No disturbance, no removal, no forgetting that the man who flew it had never left that place in spirit. The Bramblett family's journey had changed them. Where once there had been a gap in their family history, there was now a complete chapter. Tragic, yes, but also filled with pride. They had stood where Jerry had fought his last battle against the elements, and in doing so, they had pulled him from the shadows of the vanished into the light of remembrance. For the historians, the discovery reinforced a truth they had long understood. War leaves more than battlefields behind. It leaves stories scattered across the earth, waiting in jungles, deserts, and oceans to be rediscovered. Each wreck, each relic, is a bridge between the living and the dead, a reminder that history is not locked away in books. It breathes in the places where it happened. And somewhere beneath the green cathedral of Papua New Guinea's canopy, the silver P-38 Lightning still rests, its twin booms stretching like outstretched arms, its nose pointing toward the horizon. Time will continue to weave vines around its frame. Moss will soften its sharp edges, but its story will no longer be silent. Jerry Bramblett vanished in 1944. He was found in 2005. And now, through the voices of those who sought him and the family who loved him, he will never vanish again.